some of you that are not aware, he's the Emeritus Director of the New York Botanical Garden. So we can cover a wide breadth of issues here with us. But anyway, it's my pleasure to introduce Carl Totemeier.
He just doesn't know me, calling me interesting. Let's go with slides initially. We'll go through them rather quickly. There we go. I spent, before retiring, about 25 years in New York City and its suburbs. And one of the problems with most of my jobs was that they were pretty much administrative, and I didn't get my hands in that contaminated dirt that he was talking about. So we were looking for a place to retire. We wanted it to be, pretty much rural. We wanted some culture, which said university. We wanted land so I could do the things that I'd wanted to do. We bought 25 acres outside of Fayetteville, and we're not sorry. Gives me some space to do things. I wanted something to do when I got here. And I knew that I would lose apple trees if I planted them, but some would survive. So indeed, at a nook in the back of the New York Botanical Garden, I bought some apple trees, propagated from them, and ended up with 2,000 apple trees that I planted. Most survived, and soon after we got here, in essence, they had begun to flower and bear. So that was what I really had intended to start out with, was fruit. I also tried some other things, like sweet corn and other vegetables, except for the fact that the soil is a little bit too rocky to cultivate, and even using Roundup, I didn't seem to kill that doggone Johnson grass. And if you look at this field, it looks not like a field of sweet corn, but it looks like a field of Johnson grass. So that was out the window. In addition to the apples, I began to grow raspberries and some blackberries and so forth. And actually this worked out quite well in the beginning. Red raspberries that ripen in the middle of the summer here, very often on the south side of the row, will get sunburned. Okay, we'd sell the fresh fruit, what fresh apples we had, but using minimum spray program, in essence, I would have good fruit to sell, and yet there would be enough usable but second quality fruit that I could make cider, and I made juice out of the sunburned raspberries and blackberries and so forth, and blended juices. And I could sell, as much as I could grow. People would, in the end of the season, buy it by the gallon to freeze to have for winter. And then came along 3 seasons in a row without much in the way of apple production. 2 involved late freezes, 1 involved fire blight. So in essence, I was just decided that it wasn't worthwhile, and then of course the gentleman that preceded me gave the other reason why I'm really not doing much of that at this point. My wife keeps reminding me that I'm supposed to be retired, and that also says that I don't go out and spend $10,000 for a flash pasteurizer. So what am I going to do? Well, much of my career was at institutions where there were extensive perennial gardens. And one of them was Old Westbury Gardens on Long Island. This is a former North Shore estate. It's the mansion from the front. And one of our major features was our perennial garden. So I was pretty much familiar with growing perennials. New York Botanical Garden, where I worked prior to retirement. This is the Enid A. Hop Conservatory, and if you want to talk about oasis in the middle of the city, you can see it right here in this aerial view. And we had perennial gardens there, and someday this would be a topic that people might be interested in, the difference between those 2 perennial gardens. Both, whoops, I'm getting vicious here, both in essence intended to have continuous interest through the season, but using 2 different methods to do it. So I had a background in perennials, and if you really analyze that for someone who is retired, raising perennials really fit the time slot, and my wife's nudging to say, you're really retired, aren't you, better than did the other. This
Regrettably, I didn't bother to put a tripod on it. I just held it up to this picture, but this shows where we settled out west of town here. You see near the barn in the just a little to the right side of the center, the greenhouses, the plastic houses that I use in the production of perennials. I do still grow some cantaloupe in the plowed area there, the cultivated areas where I, a couple of years ago, grew a crop of cantaloupe. Okay, at this point, basically it's a one-man operation. My wife does help. She helps sell. She helps with some of the watering and so forth, but really this is my thing. She has her other interests. I have 3 houses that are approximately 50 feet long by 12 feet wide, which gives you an aisle down the center and about 5 feet of space on either side, which is about as much as you're going to want to reach to get a pot out of there. What I do with these is to cover them with plastic usually about the middle of February, and then let nature take its course. What heat comes under that plastic is enough to get these things started and puts me about a month ahead of plants that would not have been protected in this manner. The only heat that goes into them really is that when you begin to get plants in growth with some growth on them and you get a cold night, I have one of these Mr. Heater LP gas radiant heaters that fits on top of a cylinder of gas, and I get about 5 nights out of one of the size tanks that goes with a barbecue. About $1 a night is what it costs to do it. So minimal heat. It's just to get them going a little quicker so that when the market opens and other people's things are just coming up out of the ground, I've got things to sell. I'd never make 2 of the houses the same. It's more fun if you make them all different. This is a wooden one. Actually, it goes back to the first house with plastic I built back in about 1955 in California. One of the things that I really sort of feature are the hostas, and you see a big batch of hostas here. I don't sell small plants. I sell established plants so that people will have a chance to see what they're going to look like. So this would be just ahead of selling in the spring. What I do then about, sometime soon after, well, actually a little bit ahead of the 1st of May, because you do see the apples flowering in the background, and I hate it. I'm really abandoning at this point, but it gets hot. And these are really temporary facilities just to provide protection. And so when it gets warm enough, then I just cut the top of the plastic off. I'd leave the sides, however, as a windbreak for a while. Now I've got a fence as a windbreak on one side and pine trees on the other. But still, particularly when that growth is rather tender in the spring, if you get strong winds that come through there, you can have some problems. You're going to have to water more often, among other things. So I'll leave that on as long as it stays, and it provides some wind protection. Another one of the houses, this is stuff pretty much ready to sell. This is the other end of that wooden house, and you see Bleeding Heart ready to go, and you see the hostas over in the background. So this is how I get started in the season. Now, those 3 houses won't hold everything. I've got a long bed on the north side of this house that you'll see in a minute, and there's a permanent bed along the north side of the barn. Those are the places where usually the things that are either going to flower too early if I put them indoors. And I want them to flower at their normal time, therefore I leave them outside, and in fact on that one next to the barn it's in the shade, and that delays them further. So the real early things then don't flower before the market opens. This year I sort of ran out of space and began to fill up my aisle here so that I couldn't get in with the tractor, so every time I bought a bale of peat I had to either wheel it in with a wheelbarrow or carry it in by the old method of straightening your back. I just had too many things to fit all the spaces. A shade house built onto the barn that I use primarily as a place to assemble those things that are about ready to sell, so that very often I just load out of there when time comes to load the truck to go to the market. This is the bed to the north of the greenhouse. Again, things that I don't attempt to force, let them come at their own speed. You still see along the side The plastic, and that year, Mark, I was covering with burlap. You still see it there because there could be the possibility of frost, and I could just pull it over it at night. Most of the things would take it, but you might have a little damage. Looking from the other end, some of these things, again, are about ready to sell. This is a picture taken in the fall, and I hadn't taken it down, but last summer, with all the heat and the drought, even these beds that were completely exposed out in the open were just getting too much sunlight. And the only thing I had on hand was this fencing material that they use around construction sites. So I put that on, and on this bed I actually doubled it, and it was getting probably about 35% shade. The rest of the houses, and I don't have a picture of it, are covered about mid to late May with shade fabric. What I've discovered is that in my situation, the 47% shade fabric works better. If you get it too heavy, too dense, you don't get enough light. And that seems to strike a happy medium. You get good foliage, you get protection from winds and so forth. You don't have to water as often, and the plants are just much nicer. Propagation, I don't propagate a lot of things from seed. They tend to be the more common things. And this doesn't mean that you don't sell them, and some of them I might the first time around actually propagate from seed. You will sometimes get variation in seedling populations, and if that occurs, I may select the best plant or plants and keep them as stock plants and then propagate them subsequently by cuttings or by division. This happens to be a Stokes aster that was ready to divide this fall. So I knocked it out of the pot, and you see you've got a good root system. And depending on what it is, the kind of pressure it takes, or force it takes to divide it, sometimes it's an axe, sometimes it's a pocket knife, and sometimes it's just an old rusty machete. And you cut it into as many pieces as fits your situation, and you have a piece of top and a piece of root. I like to do this and get, regardless of the method of propagation, I really like to have these potted about the period from the middle of September to middle of October. That gives the roots enough opportunity to get established in those pots before cold temperatures in winter, and then they get warmed up in the spring and they're pretty much ready to sell. I don't really sell anything much at all other than things in gallon containers. What I've discovered is that there are some really excellent gardeners, knowledgeable gardeners in Fayetteville. They know what they're looking for. They can recognize a plant even if it's not in flower. But there are some who are very serious about buying plants, but they really wouldn't know it if you sold them a plant in a pot that wasn't in flower, whether you were selling them lettuce or a perennial. So for this reason, I really sell hardly anything except grasses and hostas that are not in flower. Mostly in gallon containers. Occasionally, if it's something you can't hold long enough, something that particularly that comes later in the season and gets a lot of size to it, I might go up a size. But you can't have too big of pots, or you just can't haul enough stuff in at a time to go into the market. I do have a small propagation house, a mist system that you see there, and root cuttings under the mist, and those things I do propagate from seed, I will propagate in that house. This is only an 8-foot by 20-foot house. At this point, I just heat it with electric heaters. I've got 2 of them mounted in, one in each end. Set the thermostat a little bit lower on one so that it doesn't kick in, except or unless the first one can't quite carry it. You see a bit of my crop of hostas. This was this fall. They were beginning to go dormant even inside. That's the crop I will sell 3 years from now, assuming that I'm still here 3 years from now. I don't really sell hostas until they've gotten big enough that people can see what they look like. In fact, this year a few people were complaining about, oh, I'm not going to spend that much money for them, and then I pulled out one I'd bought from Walmart and stuck it on the tailgate beside it, and they saw the difference and realized that 3 years later they might, with the one they bought from Walmart, have what I was selling them. In the winter, I don't really open any vents on this little greenhouse. I just cut a hole in the side of the barn and put a fan up there with a thermostat, and under the bench there's a return, and I heat my workroom in the barn with the heat from the greenhouse on a nice sunny day. Here's the majority of the 3 year from now crop of hostas. some of them beginning to go dormant, and soon after that I moved them outside. The ones in the center had been out already a week or two and they'd gotten the frost on them. The others had just been put out, but you won't see those hopefully for about 3 years. This fall, this was a rugged summer. It was difficult to keep things watered. And I couldn't do it by hand, literally, because you'd finish, get to one end, you had to start over at the other, and you couldn't get anything else done. So I did use sprinklers. And in doing that, you know, some perennials don't like as much water as others. Well, I kept the bulk of them alive, but did lose some here and there. But in any case, I went through the whole works this fall, divided, repotted, spaced out again, and refilled the houses. And this is taken in one of these houses just after I had done that. They're sitting there waiting for winter. Many things in this climate in a good year would come through with no problems. But as you're all probably aware, the roots of plants are not as tolerant of cold temperature as the top. There's about a 20-degree differential there with many plants. And if you get that one cold spell that may come along, we had one here, you know, a week ago, it may be sufficient to kill even a hardy plant because of the fact that that soil is going to get colder than it would if that plant was actually in the ground. So you really have to cover them. You saw burlap that I had used at a previous time, and I liked it because I felt, you know, you'll get some of these hot periods when it gets to be 70 degrees in the middle of the winter, and I was a little concerned about really sealing them up tightly, and burlap would breathe. Problem with it was that there are some plants, such as columbines, that cannot take excessive moisture, and they'll rot off at the collar if you are not in a position to limit that moisture when they're dormant in the middle of the winter. So as the result, this year I am trying this. It's a microfoam, a little foamy, they use it for packaging a lot, but it's polyethylene rather than bubble pack. I nailed the edges along the sides so the wind couldn't get under it. Just let them overlap in the walkways, and then came along on top with about 3 inches or so of wheat straw to keep that sun out. And then subsequently I took down, and later I took the one down you still see up in the air, but anyway, I took these plastic fence strips and covered it to keep the wind from blowing it off. So far it looks good. The other thing I did in there, by the way, is that I put pieces of mouse and rat bait, the bar type things in here and there, because last winter I did have some problems with rodents under it. Now I didn't really take this year, or any year, many pictures of the farmer's market itself in my display. Sarah had one this morning that I was right in the center of the thing. We have a 4x8 space. Normally it isn't really enough for a display of plants because you've got plants in gallon containers and above, and you really can't get a lot of them in a display, you know, in that size. So that's the one limiting factor in my situation. I try to arrange them to look more as if they were in a garden rather than in rows. And I think that most people like that. I use a riser such as the one you see. In fact, I use the one that you see here. Goes on the other end of the truck. But that tends to give you a little bit more noticeable display and gets things up at eye level. And when you get plants in bloom, as I sell them, and they're up at eye level, why, you attract the attention of the people as they go by. I didn't have any pictures of this except a snapshot my wife took, and I didn't put the close-up lens on, and I handheld it, so it's not a perfect picture, but that riser functions also as an extended tailgate for the pickup truck. It lays on its back. It enables me to build about 2 feet more load out onto the tailgate. The front of it is double-decked so that you have 2 layers of shorter plants in front protected by the half shell that's on top there of the truck from the wind for taller things. So I can get quite a few plants in that little truck. I could get a bigger truck. My wife keeps saying, but you're retired. So there are some of these built-in limitations, you see, that sort of cramp my style a little bit, but nevertheless they do keep me from getting into a little bit too far. And occasionally you see you get to visit a grandchild or two during the season. That basically finishes the slides. I'll run through some points that I want to make at this point. The greenhouses I make myself. The hoop greenhouses, I have a pipe bender that if you put them in just the right way, 2 10-foot sections of the 1-inch outside diameter conduit will make a 12-foot house. That one can also be used, if you follow the recipe, to make a 22-foot house, but that takes piecing and cutting and so forth. But these are just right for perennials. You can stand in that aisle and reach wherever you need to reach. The plastic, as I've said, goes on in mid-February. It comes off as soon as it gets so that you can't control the temperature inside by just opening the doors. Shade fabric goes on then sometime in May and stays on until fall, about the time you begin to divide and replant. The propagation we've pretty well covered, mostly by division, some by cutting, a few by seed. I will, particularly when buying a new variety in, will buy them wholesale in plugs. And the market allows that as long as you have about 6 weeks. Well, I plant them in the fall and don't sell them until spring, so that they're well established, and that is in keeping with the rules of the market. Soil, most of the potting soils that are on the market are intended for growers that use constant feed as such in the water. And they're dealing with thousands of everything. I'm dealing with 25, 50, 100 of a kind. Very often, in perennials particularly, each has its specific requirements. So you really can't use that constant feed in the water approach with these things. And where you are hand watering and feeding separately, in essence, many of those prepared soils are they just drain, they dry out too rapidly. You're going to have to water them too often. So I make my own soil mix, and basically it involves this: about 4 parts sphagnum peat, 2 parts composted manure, 2 parts topsoil, 3 parts coarse perlite, and sometimes I will work bark into that if it's a plant that I know needs especially good drainage, particularly, again, columbine and some of those things. As far as fertilizers are concerned, I find that this mix, for example, has some basic fertility to it because of manure in the topsoil, especially trace elements. You don't really have to worry about trace elements with it. Once I get them potted and they begin to get their roots established, I will usually come along and feed the pot with Osmocote or something comparable to that as slow-release fertilizer. Then through the season, I will follow up just by eyeballing it, and if something is not quite what you want it to be, you give it a liquid feed, usually just a balanced fertilizer as such. And the critical thing here is that you don't want your perennials to be too lush. You'll have to stake them, they're going to flop over, or they'll get too big for the pot, and you'll end up having to shift them up a pot size, and that may just lose your profit for you. You avoid excessive feeding, in other words. Irrigation, again, basically by hand, primarily because of the fact you have all kinds of plants and they do have different requirements. Pest control, I really had very few problems. I usually release a whole bunch of ladybugs and lacewings in the spring, but you will have to watch then for other problems that come along. The biggest ones with perennials in recent years have been the armyworms that were a problem this year. And with those, I always will use, with this sort of thing, across-the-counter chemicals. Basically, in other words, they're not restricted. They're not among the most potent things as far as the danger is concerned. And some of these plants may be sold rather quickly, so you really don't have the leeway of waiting a week before somebody handles them. So I use that sort of thing without any problems. Slugs and particularly little snails this year were more of a problem than anything else. I do use my favorite is Bug Getta, the Ortho product, and I like that one because if you smell it, you smell it fermented odor, like, you know, stale beer will do the same thing, but it says about the same odor. Ortho impregnates the methaldehyde into dried orange pulp from the orange juice production, and it attracts them. So that's why I use that particular one. Other than that, not really any major problems. Weed control. This soil mix is pretty free of weeds. What comes in primarily is stuff that blows in. And by and large, again, because there is a wide range of material here, and some may be tolerant to herbicides and some not, I really primarily hand weed. Some of the things in the ground that I grow and in the ground and dig, I will use herbicide on. For example, all my hostas are grown in beds under oak trees in the shade, and then I dig, pot, and sell. The first year before they grow together, you may have some weed problems. Well, that's a hand weeding job. After that first year, they grow together, and you usually don't have any weed problem, except maybe one here and there. But the problem that you will have is that the frost comes, they die down to the ground in the winter, and then winter annuals come up. Well, they die back to the ground or below the ground. I can come along in February with Roundup right over the top of them. Same thing with daylilies, with most daylilies. And you will eliminate that just ahead of the season as such, and that basically takes care of all the weed problems that I have. Winter protection you saw. Now, as far as actually selling them, again, an attractive display sells. I mentioned primarily the limitations in the market. It's a wonderful place, but I could use twice the space as far as display is concerned. I have to add, too, and I don't think maybe this was brought out maybe this morning, one of the advantages of that farmer's market in Fayetteville is that it's a social experience. You meet everyone from, you know, someone coming in from some county way back in the woods, someplace that only shows up, you know, once a month, to a retired senator, to a professor from the university, tourists from all over. One day at the farmer's market a couple of years ago, two families came through on the same day that had lived within eyesight of the New York Botanical Garden in the Bronx. How often would you think something like that would happen? So anyway, it's a wonderful experience. The other thing, and I have to add this, there develops a certain camaraderie between the vendors that I think is wonderful. So I enjoy it. Even if I didn't have any plants to sell, I'd probably be down there. But attractive display sells. Blooms sell, which is why I sell in bloom, most things in bloom. The other thing is that I find that I do need to add a few new things each year. That keeps the really experienced gardeners that already have lots of plants coming back to buy their things there. It also gives you a little competitive edge with the other vendors. You know who the best customer for a new thing is? When you first put it on the market, when they first see it, it's another vendor. And you know it's going to be on their display in about 2 years. So you always try to keep just a little bit ahead of it. Customer relations, be friendly, reach out to the public. If you sort of sit on your tailgate, you'll see these people come by and kind of look out of the corner and walk on by. If when you see that first sideways glance, you speak up and say, "Good morning, how are you today?" or some such thing, more often than not, they'll stop. You get a conversation going with them, and first thing you know, you've sold them a plant or two. They maybe didn't really intend to buy one, but that's the important thing, is to reach out to the customers. Pricing. This is kind of a pet thing with me. We were talking about it at lunch. I don't know why it is that farmers feel they always have to apologize for the price of their product. Here you're selling them the best quality and the freshest material and so forth, and yet it always seems that we who are involved in agriculture kind of apologize, and we may apologize only by selling the stuff too cheap. So anyway, my philosophy basically is that you grow quality. You know at least to some degree, what your costs are. And you don't pay any attention to what Walmart charges, what the garden center charges. You charge what that product is worth. And if you're selling a good quality product, you're not going to get many turndowns. They're going to buy. And another part of my philosophy basically is that if you're going to try to sell by cutting price, you're really not hurting just yourself, but you're hurting the vendor around the corner, because that tends to affect them too. So if you're participating in a farmer's market just to give plants away, get another hobby. Do something else. One of the things that I do very often, particularly in season with a particular kind of plant, for example, or in the fall, is that I will sometimes do handouts. And here's one that I brought a few extras of. You want to help yourself to one of them. The small one is on planting in the fall, the advantages of it. The one beside it, by the way, is a chart which shows you the implications or the results of cutting price. How much more do you have to sell to take in the same amount of money if you cut your price by 5%, 10%, etc. So you might find that that will come in handy sometime in pricing. But those are yours to take. That's basically it. Any quick questions? Yes, sir.
Would you repeat your mix breakdown?
Yeah. Oh, here it is. 4 parts sphagnum peat, 2 parts composted manure, 2 parts topsoil, 3 parts coarse perlite, and then, as I said, sometimes I will add some composted bark if it's something that I think needs a little more drainage than that will give me. One of my pet peeves as well, and I'll say this and end with it. Actually, you know, the best place to buy, the cheapest place to buy most of the ingredients is Walmart or Lowe's. They sell cheaper than the wholesale distributors can sell it. It bugs me. I hate to do it, but there it is. Now, the other thing that really bugs me about this is that the best quality composted manure and composted topsoil, you know where it comes from? My home state of Iowa. And look at all of the compostable material that we have in Arkansas that we're concerned about putting on too heavily on the fields and flushing down the streams, etc. And we need more commercial composting operations so that that particular product is made available to gardeners, etc., and is used appropriately. That's the end of my sermon. I do thank you very much.